This is section 10.6, solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Okay, so the solutions of a quadratic equation in standard form, where ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, can be found using this formula. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now that seems like a crazy formula. I actually have a song that we'll learn to help you remember it. Remember when it says a is not equal to 0, it's just talking about how we can't have a 0 in the denominator. And b squared minus 4ac is greater than or equal to 0. All that means, think about if there was a negative number under the square root, then it would be no solution. So that has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so for example, 3x squared plus 5x equals 8. To use the quadratic formula, it has to be in standard form. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract 8 from both sides. So we get 3x squared plus 5x minus 8 equals 0. And now, I find it easiest when you're doing the quadratic formula to go ahead and write out what's a, b, and c. So in this case, a is 3, the coefficient of x squared, b is 5, and c is negative 8. Okay, so now I'm just going to plug it into my formula. So I get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 8 all over 2 times 3. So now I'm just sort of doing the math. 5 squared is 25, minus 4 times 3 times negative 8 is going to become negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 96 all over 6. Well, 25 plus 96, that becomes 121. So we get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 121 over 6. Now, this one worked out to be a nice number. It's not always going to. Okay, so sometimes you're going to have to approximate and round to the nearest hundredth. But in this case, the square root of 121 is either positive 11 or negative 11. So what we can do is write it out, negative 5 plus 11 over 6, or negative 5 minus 11 over 6. Negative 5 plus 11 is positive 6. 6 over 6 is 1. Negative 5 minus 11 is negative 16 over 6, which simplifies to negative 8 over 3. And we can either leave it as a fraction or write it as decimal. But in this case, those would be our two solutions. So remember, if we were to graph, that's where it would cross the x-axis. Okay, for another example, again, it has to be in standard form, so I'm going to subtract x from both sides. I get 2x squared minus x minus 7 equals 0. Again, I think it's helpful to write out a is 2, b is negative 1, that's the coefficient of the x, and c is negative 7. So this time when I'm plugging it into the formula, I have negative b, well, a negative 1 becomes positive 1, plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared is just positive 1, minus 4 times 2 times negative 7, all over 2 times 2. So I have negative 4 times 2 is negative 8 times negative 7 is positive 56. So I have 1 plus 56, which becomes 1 plus or minus square root of 57 all over 4. Now, square root of 57 is not a pretty number, but we can find the decimals for this. I have 1 plus square root of 57 over 4, and 1 minus the square root of 57 over 4. Okay, so if we type those in the calculator, make sure that you're adding the top or subtracting the top first before you divide by 4. And then we end up with, rounded to the nearest hundredth, x equals positive 2.14 and negative 1.64. And again, here's a nice visual for us. If we were to graph this equation, we could still get the same answer. So that just tells us where it's crossing the x-axis. Okay, so the nice thing about the quadratic formula is that it works for any quadratic equation. Doesn't matter what it looks like, it will always work. So in this example, this would probably be one where we would factor normally, but we can also use the quadratic formula. Okay, so remember before, if we factored, we would do x plus 3, x minus 2, and set each side equal to 0 and get x equals negative 3, positive 2. And of course, in this case, that's definitely the fastest way to do it. But I just want you to see that the quadratic formula will also work. So my a in this case is 1, my b is also 1, and my c is negative 6. So I get negative 1 plus or minus the square root. B squared is 1 minus 4 times 1 times negative 6 over 2 times 1 is 2. So negative 4 times negative 6 times 1 is positive 24. 1 plus 24 becomes 25. Square root of 25 is 5, or negative 5. So x equals negative 1 plus 5 over 2 and negative 1 minus 5 over 2. Well, negative 1 plus 5 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Negative 1 minus 5 is negative 6. Divided by 2 is negative 3. So we get the same thing. I just want you to realize that the quadratic formula will always work. So if you find yourself stuck and you can't figure out how to factor, quadratic formula will also work. Okay, so here's another example where we would normally want to take a square root. Remember, to get x squared by itself, we could divide by 3 on both sides. Get x squared equals 9, take the square root, and x equals 3 and negative 3. Okay, but what I want you to see, the quadratic formula will still work. So 3x squared minus 27 equals 0. Well, this time a is 3, b is 0, and c is negative 27. So let's see how that works. Negative 0, well, that's just 0. So 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared is 0, minus 4 times 3 times negative 27 over 2 times 3. Okay, and we get plus or minus the square root. When you multiply that out, you get 324 over 6. Well, the square root of 324 is 18. So x is positive 18 over 6 and negative 18 over 6, which when simplified becomes positive 3 and negative 3. So yes, the second way was much more complicated, but if you're stuck, if you can't graph for some reason, and you can't figure out how to factor or take a square root, this will also work. So the quadratic formula works for any quadratic equation. And that's it for this section.